Shalom, Izzy here with Holy Language Institute at holylanguage.com. Wanted to show you a page here from the Mishnah, which is the earliest Jewish commentary on the Torah, basically. It's a record of how the Jewish community fleshed out the law and kept the commandments as a group of people, both in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel. This is a really interesting tractate. It's dedicated to the there's a passage in the Torah that talks about levirate marriage. The Hebrew word is yibum, which is where, let's say that there's a guy married to a woman and he dies and they never had a boy. In that case, then if the guy had a brother, then his brother would marry his brother's widow, and they would attempt to have a boy together, and then that first boy would actually legally belong to the first guy, and then he would carry on the family name and whatnot. And it was optional, and there was a ceremony of the guy couldn't do it. You remember that? Maybe you remember this scenario from the book of Ruth, which was kind of from that. So, anyways, there are a lot of really interesting questions that come up in conjunction with that law, and there's a whole tractate that addresses those questions. Much of the Mishnah is case law. So you'll have the law, and then you'll say, well, here's a maaseh, here's an actual situation in which this happened, and this was the legal decision that was arrived at. These were the opinions. This was the differing opinion, and then these were this was the majority opinion that that emerged. Those kinds of things. So it's really fascinating, just to see like the Torah in action, so to speak, and also the Mishnah. The Mishnah really helps it sets the stage for the New Testament, basically. Because, even though the Mishnah was written down in the late 100s, much of it was around in the time of Yeshua of Nazareth and his disciples. So it gives a lot of historical information. And I want to give you a little example here. All right. Specifically, okay, so let's say, there's also a law in the Torah, don't marry your relatives, basically. That's a really, really good advice. A really good law to have, actually. It's interesting that we still have that law today. Marrying your close relatives is actually illegal, just like it was in the Torah. And so here's a problem. What if doing levirate marriage means you had to marry a close relative? All right. And so it classifies 15 types of familial relations that disqualified levirate marriage. And we're not going to go into all those. I just wanted to show you here the word for a fellow wife. It's funny because here it's translated as fellow wife, which sounds, maybe a little bit friendly, amiable. The Hebrew word, though, is not at all. It's the plural here is tsarot, and the singular is tsara, and that's actually a word that's used in the Hebrew scripture. So this legal term is rooted in the Tanakh, and I'll show you where it is actually. And the reason I'm showing you all of this is because this helps us to better understand the words of the Master in Matthew 24 about the Great Tribulation. So here's the story about a guy named Elkanah who married two women, and one of them, she couldn't have a baby, and the other one was super mean to her and just like wore her down every day to the point where she was just ground down to nothing, and she just couldn't stop crying, and she couldn't even eat. It was awful. And it's interesting here because the word there for Hannah's fellow wife is this word right here. It's actually translated as her rival, and that is definitely a sense of the word. Here it is in Hebrew, tzara. And here it says tzarata, meaning her tzara. And so in other words, it's her tzara, her quote fellow wife. Well, the word here is translated rival, but what does tzara literally mean? Here's another passage, Jeremiah chapter 30. This chapter is actually the context for Yeshua's words about the end of days in Matthew 24. So here Jeremiah says, "That day is so great, there's none like it. It's a time of distress for Jacob. yet he shall be saved out of it. All right, so three thoughts there, really. I'll show you the Hebrew here. So it says gadol. If you know any Hebrew, then you probably know this one. Gadol means big. It also means great. So gadol, hayom hahu, that day. So that's going to be a big day. Me'ayin kamohu, none like it. Ve'et, and a time of tzara. There's our word, tzara. How is it translated here? Distress. It's has the sense of trouble or tribulation. Le Yaakov, for Jacob. Umemena, and from it, Yivashea, he'll be saved. And maybe you know a Hebrew name that sounds similar to Yivashea, that comes from the same Hebrew verbal root, yasha. What does yasha mean? To save. There's this story in the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew where this malach, this messenger, appears to this young girl named Miriam, and he says, you're going to have a baby, and name him Yeshua, because he will yasha his people from their sins. That quote doesn't make any sense in Greek, and it doesn't make any sense in English. Name him Jesus because he'll save his people from their sins. I don't know if I understand the connection. Well, it's because there isn't one. Unless you look at the name of Jesus as a Hebrew name and you recognize that clearly this messenger was speaking to Miriam in which language? The only language that would make sense in. And that's not surprising. All the early church fathers said that Matthew originally wrote his gospel in Hebrew, so go figure. All right, so anyways, it's really... So there are two things here in this Great Tribulation chapter that you're going to miss if you're just reading it in English. Firstly, that this time of distress for Jacob is talking about a tribulation. Okay, actually there are more than two things. Secondly, that this word is also the word for a polygamous nightmare, where you have rivalry because there's another woman. Polygamy was not intended to be at the beginning for some very good reasons. And then thirdly, right away, as soon as it mentions it, it says, and he's going to be yashad, he's going to be saved from it. There's going to be Yeshua salvation. All right, so that's really powerful. Now, having said that, let's look at one more passage together. Here are the Master's actual words in Matthew 24, and here's an attempt at reconstructing the original words of Yeshua in Hebrew. This is a Hebrew gospel, so to speak, done by a great Christian Hebraist who lived in the 1800s named Professor Franz Delitzsch. So, what's Great Tribulation in Hebrew? Tzara Gedolah. So it's interesting. Both of those words are used in the Jeremiah passage. So we have tzara, and then we also have Gedolah, except here it's in the masculine Gedol. So there's a lot of hope there, actually. I mean, if you're like a kid and you grow up hearing about the Great Tribulation, it freaks you out. You know what I mean? But if you actually look at like the original place where it's mentioned, like right away it says, and he's going to be saved from it. So it's going to be a bad time for the world, and it's going to be okay. So that's worth noting. It's not something to freak out about or to be like terrified about, because Emmanuel, because God with us, because he's going to be yashad, he's going to be saved from it. There will be Yeshua. All right. So anyways, that's something to note. So does that give you maybe a little bit of a better understanding of the Great Tribulation when you read the New Testament in the context of the Hebrew Bible, when you listen to the words of the Master and understand them rooted in the Hebrew language, and also when you understand the teachings of Yeshua in the Mishnaic context? The Mishnah wasn't written down yet, but much of the Mishnah was around in Yeshua's time, and it was taken very seriously. It was memorized word for word, and then communicated, transmitted word of mouth. And it was the law of the land. It was it was how the Jewish community was living out the Torah. And whether you agree with all of the Mishnah or not, the reality is that it was there. And the reality is that any community that wants to actually keep the Torah, they have to develop some kind of Mishnah. especially if the Torah is their civil law. It's just the way it's going to work, right? So anyways, regardless of your feelings about the Mishnah, and I'm not saying, of course, that the Mishnah is all gospel truth or that it's all 100% infallible doctrine. Of course not. But it's definitely useful if you want to better understand the words of Yeshua in the New Testament. And this is an example. So there's this dynamic in this idea of the Great Tribulation of the rivalry that happens between multiple wives in a polygamous nightmare. Now, why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because, originally there was the Jewish people and they had this relationship with God, and then this new religion emerged, Christianity. And of course, originally the movement that Yeshua started, it was viewed as a sect of Judaism, just like you had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and you also had the Nazarenes, the sect of the Nazarenes. Because, it was mostly Jewish people, and then a bunch of Gentiles came in, which was great, but it was a Jewish faith. And they did Jewish things, basically. And, even the New Testament is actually a very Jewish set of writings. And then, eventually, however, it basically got hijacked by anti-Semites, and the story of Yeshua was weaponized and used against the Jewish people, which precipitated the Dark Ages. And unfortunately, that's still the situation today, to a certain degree. Many Jewish people, if you mention Jesus, the person they think of is not the person that you know. Let's say that you have encountered Yeshua of Nazareth for yourself, and he's brought you closer to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's given you a love for the Hebrew Bible and for the Jewish people. You just feel this drawing. That's great. That's very positive. But that's not the Jesus that the Jewish community has encountered historically. The Jewish people historically have encountered a Jesus who is a Gentile Christ figure and really did not like them at all. So, hopefully each of us are doing our part to follow Yeshua, to accurately represent him, not only to the world, but to the Jewish people. Hopefully even conversations like this can help with that. So it's interesting, to kind of return to that thought that, they were the Jewish people, then Christianity emerged as a what? As a rival. And then, Islam emerged also as kind of another mutant rival, so to speak. So, today you have how many Jewish people in the world? 18 or 20 million, something like that. And then how many Christians and Muslims do you have? You have like 1 billion Christians, roughly, 1 billion Muslims. So it's really interesting that you have about 20 million Jewish people. And Paul said very clearly in Romans 9-11 that the nation of Israel, the physical Jewish community, has an ongoing covenantal relationship with God. Is there a partial hardening? Yes. Does every individual Jew choose to choose that covenant relationship with God? No. But, looking bigger picture, the covenant stands. There's still that relationship. That's very clear. When Paul talked about his kinsman according to the flesh. In other words, his flesh and blood Jewish family. All right, so Paul made that very clear. So that's the case today. You have about 20 million Jewish people who still have this covenant relationship with God. And then you have, about 2 billion Christians and Muslims who say, hey, God's done with you. You guys blew it. We're the new wife. Can you feel the rivalry there? And I mean, dude, look at the numbers too. Especially, now there's the state of Israel, and Jewish people can go home and can at least, kind of protect themselves instead of, just being, I don't know. There were a lot of awful things that happened in the, when we as the Jewish people were living out in exile. So, you're safer in the Jewish state now, so to speak. But historically it sucked to be Jewish. If you lived out in the exile, then you were by far a second-class citizen in all these Christian European countries. There were multiple instances in which the whole country would kick out all of its Jewish people. That happened in almost every European country, which is a big deal. That's kind of a tribulation if you're a Jewish person and all the Jewish people just got kicked out of, let's say, Spain or England or France or Germany or something. So anyways, hopefully that gives you a fuller and maybe a more vivid sense of tribulation in the Hebrew Bible, in the Hebrew language, and who knows what that might look like in the future. I'll just offer that to you to think about. One more thing, if I could kind of offer one more thing for you to think about. It's interesting how Yeshua talked to his disciples. So firstly, notice that he says, pray that your flight won't be in the winter or on a Sabbath. Why would he say that? Like, didn't he come to do away with the law? Like, didn't he come so that, the disciples could become Christians and be free from the law and not have to do those ceremonial things, including, the fourth commandment about Sabbath? Like, he didn't actually expect that his disciples would still be honoring Shabbat, did he? Or what if he did? Why else would he say, pray that your flight won't have to be on a Shabbat? Because Yeshua expected that his disciples would still be Sabbath observant, that they would still honor Shabbat to such a degree that they would be mortified at the thought of even having to flee from an enemy on Shabbat, that they would actually pray, God, if we have to flee, don't let it be on Shabbat so that we're forced to break your holy Sabbath. Is that how you feel about Shabbat? Is that your relationship to the Sabbath? And if not, then I'd like to invite you to consider that maybe Yeshua believed that we would continue to have a positive relationship with God's holy day. And maybe that could actually be a beautiful thing in your life, a thing of joy, a source of freedom, really meaningful. I know that it is for me. It's also interesting to carry on that thought as we look at how Yeshua spoke to his disciples in Matthew 24. It's interesting to note that he talked to his disciples as if they would be there to see it all. Even just in these couple of verses. Notice he says, then there will be great tribulation. Notice that he says, then, when? During this great tribulation, if anyone says to you, because why? Because you're going to be there. Look, here's the Christ, there he is. Don't believe it. Why? Well, because there are going to be false Christs and prophets that are going to try to what? To lead astray the elect. Who are the elect? Yeshua's disciples. So, anyways, and that's not all. I would just encourage you, read Matthew 24 for yourself, and just read through it as if you'd never read it before. Notice the chronology, the time frame. Notice when he says then, and notice how he talks to his guys. If he talks to them as if they were going to be there to see this stuff and go through it. Because the answer very clearly is that he does. That's how he talks to them. But don't take my word for that. Go read Matthew 24 for yourself and see what you think. Thanks for joining me for this conversation. I hope it was thought-provoking. I hope it kind of opened your mind to maybe a bigger understanding of some beliefs that to some degree have become cliched or stereotyped. I hope that this was refreshing, that it was a fresh look for you. Hope it gave you some hope too. Yes, there will be a time of distress for Jacob, and yes, he will be saved. He will be yeshad from it. There will be Yeshua. This was actually one takeaway from my most recent lesson in our Mishnah Snapshots course. I'm going through the Mishnah, all 6 orders, something like 3,000 pages, and I'm giving you snapshots of these specific places that help us to get a better look at Yeshua of Nazareth, as a Jewish rabbi, and also that help us to better understand the New Testament, set it in its original Jewish context. It was lesson 15. This was from lesson 59. We talked about some big stuff. We talked about the Sadducees and this story that they cooked up about the woman who was married to 7 guys and they kept dying, and then so she would marry another one. The levirate marriage thing, and then they all died, and then in the resurrection, who's going to be married to who? And actually, the Sadducees got that story from the Mishnah. And they got this question of what's it going to look like in the world to come after the resurrection. They got that from the Mishnah. It's almost eerie. It's kind of a weird word. Like, it's uncanny. It's uncanny. Some of the terms that are used in the Mishnah talking about levirate marriage, it's almost like there are these like little foreshadowings of the resurrection. And definitely the Sadducees, they got hold of that. And they made up this little story and weaponized it against this doctrine of the Pharisees, the resurrection of the dead. I don't know if you knew that, but the resurrection of the dead is actually, that is the doctrine that the Pharisees championed and the Sadducees opposed. So if you believe in the resurrection, you can thank the Pharisees for that. All right. Anyways, thanks for joining me in this conversation. If you're interested in our Mishnah Snapshots course, come see us at holylanguage.com. And in the Learn section, you will see Mishnah Snapshots. And may you be inspired in your hope for the future, and inspired to follow Yeshua, and inspired to read his word with new eyes. And go read Matthew 24 now and see what you think.